Good evening. On behalf of Conflict and Resilience Research Institute Canada, I welcome all of you to our special webinar today titled Forcible Transfer of Ukrainian Children as Genocide. Dear audience, this is an important topic, and this webinar is special because we are airing it during Peace Days 2025, a time when our communities in Winnipeg, across Canada, and across the world come together to reflect on peace, compassion, justice, and the dignity of every human being. Since 2010, Peace Days has been at the forefront of promoting peace, understanding, and compassion in Winnipeg. From humble beginnings to a growing movement, Peace Days have organized and participated in countless events that have brought people together, sparked meaningful conversations, and inspired positive change. It is in this spirit of dialogue and solidarity that we gather today. Our webinar, as we already shared with you, the forcible transfer of Ukrainian children as genocide, brings into sharp focus one of the gravest allegations of our time, an issue that calls on our conscience and our collective responsibility. Before I set into deliberating the context, let me do the treaty recognition. This institute is located on the original lands of Anishinaabe, Cree, Ojibwe, Dakota, and Dene peoples, and on the homelands of Metis Nation. We all are treaty people, and we are bound together in the true spirit of truth and reconciliation. Dear audience of the Conflict and Resilience Research Institute Canada, since the full-scale invasion of Ukraine by the Russian Federation in February 2022, civilians have borne the brunt of violence and displacement. Among the most disturbing allegations is the forcible transfer of Ukrainian children from territories under occupation into Russia. Reports show children placed in camps, institutions, or Russian families, often stripped of their language, identity, and culture. The International Criminal Court has issued arrest warrants for President Vladimir Putin and Maria Lvova-Belova, Russia's Commissioner for Children's Rights, for the war crime of unlawful deportation of Ukrainian children. The United Nations and independent monitors, such as Yale's Humanitarian Research Lab, have confirmed systematic practice of relocation, forced adoption, and quote-unquote Russification. The 1948 Genocide Convention defines genocide to include forcible transferring children of the group to another group, unquote, when committing with intent to destroy in whole or in part that group. International bodies, including the Parliamentary Assembly of the Council of Europe, have argued that the evidence strongly points toward this being not only a war crime, but an act of genocide. Today, why this matters for peace, you might wonder. Because it matters for four possible reasons. First, justice and accountability. Second, the rights of children and the future of Ukraine. Third, global norms and moral responsibility. And fourthly, most importantly, local responsibility and global solidarity. If we talk about call to reflection and action, we may proceed and remember that behind every statistics is a child, a family, a story interrupted by war and injustice. Let us ask ourselves today, what role can we play as educators, citizens, leaders, or community members in ensuring accountability, justice, and the safe return of these children? May today's session not only inform us, but also inspire us to act in our communities, our networks, and our institutions to uphold human rights and advance peace rooted in justice. We must thank you, all of you, for making time. And I think this is time now to introduce our esteemed guest. Darcia Senft is our speaker today. And in this account, let me also share with you that we are going to have more two sessions with Darcia Senft on Monday and Tuesday next week. And she's a lawyer who was called to the bar in Manitoba in 1988 and in Ontario in 1993. Most recently, she was employed with the Law Society of Manitoba as General Counsel and Director of Policy and Ethics. In that capacity, Darcia provided opinions on matters affecting the Law Society and governance of its members and provided advice and directions to lawyers about their professional responsibilities and ethical obligations. While employed at the Law Society, she also prosecuted lawyers charged with professional misconduct incompetence or conduct becoming unbecoming and oversaw work of the complaints and investigation units. Darcia has been an active member of legal profession, having served as a bencher of the Law Society and a non-bencher member of various communities. Darcia had acted as an occasional instructor for the Law Society's bar admission, often called as CPLED, program and presenter at continuing professional development programs. Previously, she was a sessional lecturer at the Faculty of Law, University of Manitoba as well. In 2024, she retired early to further her legal education in the Netherlands and graduated from the University of Groningen with a master's in public international law in August 2025. She is looking forward to further engagement in public international law and intends to pursue her passions by contributing to the field. Currently, she is a member of the non-profit organization Canadian Lawyers for Ukraine. It is such a pleasure and my privilege to welcome Darcia Senft today to share the same online space and listen to her, I would say, very insightful and logical presentation on the first topic in a series of 3 episodes. And as I already mentioned, she's presenting today the first of the whole presentation. Darcia, why don't you go ahead and take the floor?
Thank you so much, Kauser, for that generous introduction. So yes, today I'd like to speak about the initial topic we identified for this series during Peacedays, and that's the forcible transfer of Ukrainian children as genocide. And I want to give some background to that because I think it's not a topic that's discussed very widely. In fact, I know that just from even speaking with friends and colleagues that many individuals aren't even aware of the practice of the forcible transfer of children, let alone any analysis about whether that amounts to something other than war crimes such as genocide. So in February of 2022, the start of the full-scale invasion in Ukraine, of course, that was a breach of international law, but the invasion, we must remember, was preceded by 8 years of conflict in eastern Ukraine between government forces and Russian-backed separatists. And even in the early stages of the war, there was evidence emerging of many alleged war crimes and the commission of mass atrocities. That evidence led to the investigations by the International Criminal Court and issuance of arrest warrants, as Kauser mentioned, for high-level representatives such as President Putin and Commissioner Maria Lvova-Belova, relating to allegations of war crime directly related to the unlawful deportation and transfer of children. However, when you look at the various atrocities that have occurred there in Ukraine, beyond the forcible transfer of children, they may be grouped into various categories that some scholars have also grouped into different categories that correlate to the enumerated acts of genocide set out in the Genocide Convention. And arguably, of course, every atrocity should be condemned. But I agree with Kauser's assessment of the situation that arguably the documented forcible transfer of Ukrainian children, and I'm going to say the number that I am currently using mostly in this presentation is the number that's on the Ukrainian government's website of at least 20,000 Ukrainian children, is the atrocity that hasn't received nearly the media attention, arguably, that it warrants. These are acts that on their own, just looking at the forcible transfer of children, may amount to the crime of genocide when committed with the special intent to destroy in whole or in part a national, ethnical, racial, or religious group. And I'd like to just consider briefly the legal framework under the Genocide Convention to look at what elements of the crime amount to. So if you can go to the next slide, please, Kauser. So after World War II, the Genocide Convention was created to codify the crime of genocide in an instrument of international law. State parties to this convention undertake to prevent and punish this crime and other crimes that are related to it, such as direct and public incitement to commit genocide. Those who commit it must be punished, whether they are public officials or private individuals. And there's both a physical and mental element to the crime. Under Article 2 of the Genocide Convention, you'll see that genocide means any of those 5 enumerated categories: killing members of the group, causing serious bodily or mental harm to members of the group, deliberately inflicting on the group conditions of life calculated to bring about its physical destruction in whole or in part, imposing measures intended to prevent births within the group, and E, the subject of today's discussion, forcibly transferring children of the group to another group. This definition has been widely accepted in international law, including in the Rome Statute of the International Criminal Court. And it's important to note that the crime of genocide does not necessarily imply the actual extermination of a group in its entirety, if you look at those different categories. Conduct is understood as genocide once any one of those acts referenced in Article 2A through E is committed with the referenced specific intent. You can go to the next slide, please. As I mentioned, and in criminal law, I don't know for those who are going to be listening today or logging on afterwards, how many are lawyers, or if there are people who have no knowledge about criminal law, but typically we talk about both a physical element to a crime. So in this case, it would be the forcible transfer of children. And then there's a mental element that we also refer to typically as the mens rea. But in the case of genocide, there's something specific, a special intention that's required, and it's often called dolus specialis among those of us who like to speak in Latin or are forced to as lawyers. But it's the specified act committed with intent, the intent to destroy in whole or in part a national, ethnical, racial, or religious group. So genocide is distinct in that the perpetrator must not only have the normal mens rea or mental element to commit one of those acts that we talked about, but also the intent to destroy the group in whole or in part. In the Croatia versus Serbia decision out of the International Court of Justice, the court recognized that the intent to destroy in whole or in part one of those groups is the essential characteristic of genocide that distinguishes it from other very serious crimes. It's notoriously difficult to prove this special intention due to the high standard of proof that's required to satisfy that special intention requirement. When considering state responsibility for acts of genocide, it's true that case law is actually quite scant. But more recently, some states have asked the International Court of Justice to address concerns relating to the commission of genocide by states. The main decision that you should be aware of, that we should all be aware of, is the Bosnian genocide case, is how I will refer to it, a decision on the merits in 2007, where the ICJ had to decide what constituted the appropriate standard of proof. In that case, Bosnia took the position that the standard is the balance of evidence or the balance of probabilities, in as much as what is alleged is a breach of treaty obligations. But instead, the court applied a different, more stringent standard and concluded that claims against a state involving charges of exceptional gravity must be proved by evidence that is fully conclusive. The ICJ said it had to be fully convinced that allegations of genocide or complicity in genocide have been clearly established. So despite widespread crimes committed between 1992 and 1995 that targeted Bosnian Muslims, only the mass killings of Muslim men and boys in Srebrenica were found to reach the threshold of genocide, both by the ICTY, the International Criminal Tribunal for Yugoslavia, and the ICJ. The court held that it had not been established that any of the widespread and serious atrocities were accompanied by the necessary specific intent, either on the basis of a concerted plan or on the basis that the events revealed a consistent pattern of conduct which could only really point to the existence of such intent. The case has been heavily criticized for its unrealistically high standard of proof for finding Serbia to have been legally complicit in genocide. To constitute the crime of genocide, as we noted from the earlier screen, it must be established that the victims are deliberately, meaning not randomly, targeted because of their perceived membership in a national, ethnical, racial, or religious group. The target of destruction must be the group itself, as such, or even a part of it, but not its members as individuals. And that's important to keep that in mind. We're talking about the targeting of a group. So in essence, the crime of genocide is the denial of the right to existence of one of the protected groups. And in the context of the war in Ukraine, Ukrainians as a national group are being targeted. Ukraine is very diverse, but it is united into one nation by shared allegiance to the Ukrainian state and a shared belief in the independence of their state and nation. It is precisely the characteristic of Ukrainians as a separate nation that Russia seeks to annihilate through various means. They are being attacked because of their membership in the Ukrainian nation. In looking at the evidence of intention and what is required, it's true that indications of intention to commit genocide are rarely overt. In other words, you're not going to very often see a memo from president or prime minister to their subordinates saying, we intend to commit genocide. It seems silly to say that out loud, but when we talk about how difficult it is to reach that standard of proving the requisite special intent, it's important to note that everyone recognizes that intentions that are so directly stated are going to be rare, if non-existent. And while state policy, though, may or may not provide evidence of genocidal intent explicitly, in the Croatia versus Serbia case, the court referred to the parties' agreement that the special intent may actually be also established by indirect evidence, that is, evidence deduced or inferred from certain types of conduct. The test, as set out in the Croatia decision, does not require that a pattern of conduct could only point to genocidal intent. Rather, it is sufficient if the only inference that could reasonably be drawn from the pattern of conduct is the existence of genocidal intent. Dealing with the distinct act of the forcible transfer of Ukrainian children as a genocidal act, it should be noted that the first four acts set out in the Genocide Convention share a common element, and it's the physical extermination of or physical harm to human life. Article 2E, though, is distinct because while it still involves a systematic attack on the group's essential foundations, it does not involve the actual extinction of or attempted distinction of biological life. We can go to the data and data challenges slide, please, Kauser. Thank you. The displacement and deportation of children in Ukraine, from Ukraine, has been taking place in Ukraine's occupied Crimea region and Donbass since 2014. But the practice did not actually become widely known until 2022, when the numbers of those illegal transfers rose sharply. The fact is that a significant number of Ukrainian children have been relocated either to Russia or to occupied regions of Ukraine, or even to Belarus. And that fact is well established and uncontested by both Ukraine and Russia. But the numbers vary, along with the reasons for the transfers. According to the official website of Ukraine's government, at least 19,546 children have been forcibly transferred since the start of the full-scale invasion in 2022. But the actual number is believed to be much higher. One reason why reported numbers, if you start researching this, vary depending on what reports and websites you go to, is that the sources do not always count the children using the same defined categories. Next slide, please. In some of the reports that I researched for my thesis, it noted that some of the categories could be described in the following four ways. Number one, transfers from orphanages or institutions, the forced removal following separation of children from families as part of what we call the filtration process. Number three, children who traveled temporarily with or without parental consent to what has been called re-education camps, sometimes recreation camps. Forcible evacuation of Ukrainian families with children, in other words, children who are accompanied by their families. There are three common pretexts that have been used as rationale for these transfers. We can go to the next slide, please. The first is for alleged security reasons. The next related to adoptions and foster care. And lastly, for temporary stays in, as I referenced, sometimes called recreation camps. With respect to the first pretext for transfers, security issues, or for humanitarian evacuations, under that pretext, Russia began transferring large number of civilians, including children, even during the week before the full-scale invasion, from territories of Donetsk and Luhansk People's Republic to Russia. Many children were transferred from orphanages and homes for disabled children in occupied Ukrainian territories. The Institute for the Study of War reported on evidence of plans to transfer Ukrainian children being in place before the full-scale invasion had started. They uncovered actual evidence to that effect. Human rights activists uncovered Kremlin documents that laid out plans to remove children from orphanages in occupied oblasts and bring them to Russia under the guise of humanitarian evacuations. It was determined, and it has been determined, that there's been really a deeply institutionalized project to abduct and forcibly transfer children and turn them into the next generation of, in effect, Russians. With respect to the second ground, adoptions, or second pretext, adoptions and foster care, reports about systemic displacement and deportations of underage orphans and other minors living in Ukrainian children's homes. There have been reports that even though these things are occurring, it's important to note that sometimes many of those children actually have parents, and that the transfer of these children has been done on a systematic basis. Many more children have been transferred from a variety of categories. For example, Kauser mentioned in his introduction that the Yale Humanitarian Research Lab has conducted an extensive study. They've actually, in my thesis, I relied on at least 3 of the reports, and I just noticed the other day they've come out with another report that I have not yet had an opportunity to dive into. But that lab has done extensive research over a number of months. I believe it was over 20 months initially, using open source information. And they determined that the Russian Federation has indeed engaged in systematic, intentional, and widespread coerced adoption and fostering of Ukrainian children. In terms of how the program is defined, the deportation of children and their subsequent placement with Russians and or in institutions at which they are listed in Russia's child placement database by explicit command of senior Russian officials. It's been determined that the program really was initiated by Putin and associates with the intention to Russify the children, another term that Kauser referenced in his introduction. Related orders were carried out by multiple elements of the government of the Russian Federation in close coordination with occupation officials in the Donetsk and Luhansk oblasts. Do we have time for me to mention a few of those key findings, Kauser? Okay. The Yale Humanitarian Research Lab identified at least 314 children, primarily from the eastern region of Ukraine, who were forcibly deported into a program of coercive fostering and adoption following the full-scale invasion. Deported children were moved to more than 21 regions throughout Russia and placed with Russian citizens or in institutions. As I noted earlier, the program was ordered and facilitated by Putin and other high-level officials, such as Maria Lvova-Belova, the Commissioner for Children's Rights, along with officials of the major political party in the State Duma. Following the full-scale invasion, the Russian Federation actually amended its legislation and created new legislation to facilitate its program. Children were systematically naturalized to facilitate the adoption and fostering program. Their names were entered into 3 interconnected adoption databases operated by, affiliated with, and/or coordinated closely with Russia's federal government. In October of 2022, there was a strategic shift from guardianship to adoption. with the entry of names into the referenced databases coinciding with the illegal annexation of parts of eastern Ukraine. And as I referenced earlier, the Humanitarian Research Lab has also said that they believe that the true number of children who have undergone Russia's program of coerced adoption and fostering is significantly higher than the number of children that they've been able to identify in their own reports. Amnesty International similarly has described actions evidencing state policy by the Russian Federation's authorities in the deportation of Ukrainian children. One scholar states that actions of Maria Lvova-Belova can be attributed to deliberate policy, citing remarks made during a meeting in July of 2022 with the governor of Kaluga regions and Russian families who received Ukrainian children. State officials said the transfers were the result of a comprehensive and meticulous process that took into account the legislative features of relevant regions, careful selection of families willing to accommodate children with disabilities, or large family groups of 4 to 9 children at once. In other words, it clearly wasn't random, with legislation being changed and all of this meticulously documented evidence of the program itself. With respect to activities that relate to these transfers and these so-called recreation camps, sometimes called re-education camps, it's important to examine these in a little bit of detail because of Russia's widespread use of these recreation camps that are located in occupied regions of Ukraine and actually across Russia. The Yale Humanitarian Research Lab verified the existence of at least 43 such camps and facilities. I will just mention that again, I didn't have time to look at their most recent report. It could very well be that that number is higher. And I commend you to reading their reports. They're very informative. In occupied regions, parents are told and have been told that these camps are free and they are places where their children may receive rest and protection from wartime conditions. Even if they are reluctant to send them, there are reports documented that parents experience pressure and that they have been coerced into signing consent forms by occupying forces, or they consent under duress because of the war environment itself and feel they have no other options really to get proper food or healthcare or sanitation in place for their children. There are reports of contact information for camp officials being withheld from parents, and some have even been forced to sign power of attorney forms. Some camps have delayed or even declined to return children. Some parents have not been notified of any changes of plans, and in many cases, parents who were ultimately able to regain custody of their children had to make extremely difficult and dangerous journeys to retrieve their own children in person. These camps systematically re-educate children through academic instruction, political and nationalistic indoctrination, and, I think quite shockingly, military training. Children are subject to the promotion of messages or ideas that serve the political interests of the Russian Federation and that denigrate or even deny Ukrainian identity. Children returning from camps have described forced labor, interrogations, beatings, incarcerations, poor food, lack of food, and forms of emotional violence aimed at demoralizing them and at actually erasing their Ukrainian identity. They are not only regularly subjected to education that aims to erase their Ukrainian identity, they are receiving some military-style instruction designed to prepare them for future service in the Russian military. It's important to note that these re-education or recreation camps affect children who have already been transferred forcibly, but also the approximately 1.6 million children who are currently living in occupied regions. There are reports that Russia is using a militaristic youth organization called, I don't know if I'm pronouncing it correctly, UNARMIA, to engage teens in occupied regions and prepare them to fight on the side of Russia against their own country. Amid reports that the organization started drafting teens in occupied regions, Britain announced sanctions against this organization, describing it as a Russian military organization central to Putin's attempts to forcibly deport and indoctrinate Ukraine's younger generation. They also said that the organization is involved in Russia's systematic attempt to erase Ukrainian cultural and national identity. We can now go to the next slide, Kauser. In terms of analyzing whether there is genocide in Ukraine because of even this single Article 2E action, the forcible transfer of children, it's important to consider that officials or officially endorsed Russian statements exist that point to a general plan to destroy the Ukrainian national group. And therefore, there is evidence, arguably sufficient, to meet the very high standard of dolus specialis, or that specific intent that we talked about earlier. Highest ranking officials and state representatives have denied the existence of Ukraine as a nation. They've spoken of the need for denazification and characterized Ukrainian citizens as existential threats, thereby legitimizing the goal of targeting this group for destruction. In a Telegram post, Dmitry Medvedev, a high-level official, cited as evidence of a long-term genocidal plan, and I quote, "It's no wonder that, having transformed itself into the Third Reich and having written into its history textbooks the name of traitors and Nazi henchmen, Ukraine will suffer the same fate. This kind of Ukraine gets what it deserves. These difficult tasks cannot be completed instantaneously, and they will not only be decided on battlefields." What is somewhat unusual at this war is that there is publicly available direct evidence of genocidal intent, arguably sufficient, as I said, to meet that special intent requirement. Although many atrocities have been committed during the war in Ukraine, even when focusing on only one of those specified acts in the Genocide Convention, the forcible transfer of children, there's an abundance of evidence relevant to an assessment of whether a genocide is occurring. The Yale Humanitarian Research Lab reported that as many as 35,000 children may be held in Russia or occupied territories, with many parents and guardians still unable to locate them or be reunited. Several NGOs are working very hard round the clock to return transferred children to Ukraine and to help parents or guardians retrieve their children. You should ask yourself if Russia was concerned about the safety of Ukrainian children. Remember that earlier pretext I talked about, transfer for humanitarian reasons, and thought that they should be transferred away from battle areas. They should certainly have followed the special procedures that are contained in international humanitarian law conventions relating to the evacuation of children in situations of armed conflict. For example, the Geneva Convention 4, Article 17, and the Additional Protocol 1, Article 78. To be considered lawful, in other words, evacuations of unaccompanied children must be undertaken in compliance with formal procedures to facilitate the identification and registration of parentage. As soon as transfers and evacuations occur, occupying powers must provide notification in accordance with what are strictly regulated processes, and there is a right to reestablish contact with the family. Not only has Russia ignored those legal requirements, particularly the obligation to create an identification and registration registry, it is rare that there are any proactive efforts undertaken on Russian Federation's behalf to return children, which you would expect if the transfers occurred for safety reasons. Typically, Requests for information about the location of transferred children go unanswered. There is also evidence that the names of children have been changed, new passports provided, which further hinders, of course, any efforts to locate and retrieve them. And as the war drags on, it's becoming increasingly difficult, and it will be ever more difficult on an ongoing basis to try to actually find these children and get them back into the hands of their parents or guardians. The Institute for the Study of War has reported that Russia has gone to great lengths to claim that these crimes are actually humanitarian gestures, but the legally consistent humanitarian response would be to transfer the Ukrainian children back to Ukraine-controlled territory and return them to the care of their fellow Ukrainians, not deport them to the invading country. So any pretext of the children being transferred for their own safety is disingenuous, especially when children are forcibly transferred or transferred through deception to the aggressor state and not to some neutral state, and they are made into Russian citizens eligible for adoption. As I noted previously, Russia streamlined its legislation to facilitate the adoption of Ukrainian children. And this arguably is a clear example of the aggressor state's intentions and amounts to direct evidence of genocidal intent. Senior Russian state representatives issued public statements regarding referenced changes to their citizenship laws. For example, Maria Lvova-Belova made a statement on Telegram about how temporary guardianship can become permanent now that the children had become Russian citizens. Various reports reveal the existence of a systematic program of forcible transfers to facilitate guardianship and adoption, again established at the direction explicitly of Putin and other high-level state officials. And they were created again through a meticulous and very comprehensive process. These transfers have been carried out deliberately, not randomly, in conjunction with this Russification process, which is clearly intended to erase the Ukrainian identity of these children and prevent their return to Ukraine. We can go to the next slide, please. With respect to various positions that have been taken, Kauser alluded to some of these earlier. In 2023, the Parliamentary Assembly for the Council of Europe passed a resolution describing the forcible transfer of Ukrainian children as genocide. More recently, just in May of this year, European Parliament passed a resolution strongly condemning the genocidal strategy relating to the forced transfer and deportation of Ukrainian children, indicating the strategy is designed to erase Ukrainian identity. Various scholars have observed that even an examination of publicly available sources yields ample evidence of the probability of genocidal child transfers, predominantly due to Commissioner Lvova-Belova's meticulous documentation of all of her actions and intentions on her website and in local media. And again, the Institute for the Study of War specifically uncovered Kremlin documents that laid out plans to remove Ukrainian children from orphanages and transfer them to Russia under the guise of humanitarian evacuation. And the groundwork for that massive deportation was in place before the full-scale invasion. We can go to the last slide, please, Kauser. I conclude and submit then that there's sufficient direct evidence of genocidal intent. And even without that direct evidence, if we take all of that direct evidence away, there's a pattern of destruction that's very readily discernible when all 5 of the genocidal acts being committed in Ukraine are viewed in their totality, such that genocidal intent to destroy Ukrainians may certainly be inferred, if nothing else. I'm open to questions.
Thank you so much, Darcia. As expected, she has laid out the case, I would say, very strongly. And of course, there are a number of elements that I think our audience would be much benefited today to learn and have a deeper insight about the technicalities that Darcia Senft kindly laid out before us. The audience, we are at the almost at the end of our session, but uh, before we end, I think I would like to take the privilege of having two questions only that I thought is important for education purposes as well as practice. Darcia, if you might allow me to ask the first question, and this is regarding precedent and jurisprudence. You have already discussed a bit of it. However, with regards to Article 2E of the Convention, do you see it as a challenge or an opportunity for international courts to clarify the law on child transfer as genocide? Because there is very little case law on Article 2E. So, what do you think? Opportunity or challenge?
Mm. Well, I try to look at things more as opportunities. It's true that there is a scarcity of happily so. I might add, I'm glad to say that there is a scarcity of case law on this, but I think that arguably would provide courts with greater flexibility in terms of assessing whether the forcible transfer of Ukrainian children, as described, amounts to the crime of genocide. I think that gives the court more of a blank canvas, if you will.
Fantastic. Second question would be about Council of Europe and European Parliament, and Europe being the European continent. Both bodies have explicitly described these transfers as genocide, as you also mentioned. How important are such political declarations in shaping legal outcomes or influencing public opinion?
Well, I think they're very important, and I hope that we will get into that in more detail next week in the next two planned webinars, because once important bodies like those I referenced start coming out publicly with declarations that they believe that these kinds of transfers are genocidal, I think it gives other individuals, other bodies, more courage, if you will, more room to come out and say what maybe is already very clear, and join the growing group that is saying, okay, we need to look at this because this is genocidal. And it is baffling to me that there is not a lot of media coverage about this. Even the war generally, unfortunately, people get tired of war. They get tired of the news and say they can't absorb all that bad news. And unfortunately, in the last couple of weeks, Ukraine has suffered with the shelling, the worst number of missiles and drones since the beginning of the full-scale invasion. And you hardly hear about that at all on the news. And that's the shelling I'm talking about, which of course kills civilians and in fact seems to be very targeted to residential buildings and hospitals and playgrounds and kindergarten rooms. But even this specific crime, the forcible transfer of children, is so abhorrent in terms of when you think about what that really represents. These children are forever taken from their families unless somebody has the wherewithal to find them and the ability to go and get them back. And those are very complicated stories where people have to help go through occupied regions, which are it's very dangerous for the parents if they even have the ability to go and try to retrieve their children. It's just shocking. It should be an affront to us morally. But what I've been trying to argue is that there is law on this. There's the Genocide Convention. And why isn't it being studied more? Why aren't there more discussions about this heinous crime as genocide? Mm-hmm. And that's separate and apart from war crime. As you know, of course, being a scholar in genocide, genocide can occur in times of peace or in times of war. War crimes are quite specific. And I'll be talking a little bit about why I think that's so important that this be characterized as genocide, because I believe that will impact and should impact negotiations for a just and lasting peace. But that's the subject for some other webinars.
Thank you. Thank you so much. And although it might not be framed as a question, but what do you think with regards to lessons learned? Should the international community draw from this crisis for preventing future cases of child transfers as tool of war and identity erasure? How do we learn from this case?
I think that's an excellent comment and question. I think if we don't learn from history, unfortunately, we're destined to see it being repeated. And with all the discussions of never again, and that's why the Genocide Convention was even created post World War II. But it's also very important to talk about the duty to prevent genocide, which is going to be the very specific discussion in the next webinar, and what that means. What does that mean, the duty to prevent genocide? And we'll get into some of the specifics of what I believe that means based on my research, and how I do believe that states need to have ought to have, in fact, they have the international law obligation to have their radar up, to be looking at different situations, conflicts, wars, and having an ability to analyze, according to the law, is what we are hearing reports about. Is this genocide? Never mind, is it genocide? Because that can take years for a court to establish. Does it have the hallmarks of potentially amounting to genocide? And as soon as that happens, there's a duty to start acting. And again, I don't want to get ahead of myself for the next webinar, but absolutely, states need to be paying more attention.
Thank you so much, Darcia. We'll put end to our session today, and we are very grateful actually to have learned the details of the case. And the audience, once again, a gentle reminder that on Monday and Tuesday, Darcia is going to speak on two specific topics on the same general theme. And please follow our social media feeds. You will find these details and it will be aired in the same time, 8 p.m. Central Standard Time or Central Daylight Saving Times. Dear audience, we are going to close as we say, but we would like to go back to Darcia and for this particular episode and the title that she used for this presentation. Darcia, what are your concluding thoughts, very briefly in 10 to 15 seconds?
Okay, I believe that the forcible transfer of Ukrainian children to Russia or occupied regions of Ukraine or to Belarus, definitely there's evidence, strong evidence, that there is both the acts that can be shown, the conduct, that's the first element of the crime of genocide, and that there is plenty of evidence that would be sufficient in my view to establish that high threshold of the special intent required that's specific to the crime of genocide.
Thank you so much. Although I did promise that would be the last question, but it just came to my mind that in our country, there is a change in our highest political level. Honorable Chrystia Freeland has taken over, possibly, if I am not wrong, special envoy of Prime Minister to Ukraine. What messages you might have, if you have at all, for Chrystia Freeland?
Well, I understand that officially she's been appointed to look at the reconstruction of Ukraine. And some people actually argue we shouldn't be talking about reconstruction yet when there's an active, ongoing war. I don't disagree that we should look at reconstruction, but how do you reconstruct a nation when its children have been stolen? Children, if your children are taken, I know I put a quotation by Alexandra Matvichuk, that if I can find it quickly, I would like to read out to you. She and her organization won the Nobel Peace Prize in 2022. She said, "A country without its children is a country without a future." And I found that a very compelling statement. And that's why I put it on my, almost like my cover page of the thesis, because I very much believe that you can't talk about reconstructing a nation when there's in effect an ongoing genocide.
Thank you so much. The audience, stay well and stay best at this part of this world. And those who have tuned in from the rest of the part of the world, hopefully, we are going to air 2 more episodes with Darcia during the Peace Days festival. And those who are not very much, informative about Peace Days is actually idea and the project of the Rotary Club of Winnipeg Peace Builder Committee, and is an inspirer and facilitator of a grassroots level movement working together for positive peace in Winnipeg. As peace builders, Rotary is committed to a vision, mission, and set of values that encourage, facilitate, and inspire understanding, positive peace, and goodwill. And its founders, co-founders, David Gerald Newman and Gary Sempt, they are very kind people, and they are steering this whole movement. And this is the perfect timing where we thought that we'd invite Darcia to speak on this very important topic. Folks, have a good rest of the night, and we'll see each other again, hopefully on Monday for the next episode. Bye bye.
Thank you. Bye bye.